$10 on the way out.
You just say me.
Right. It does give me a great deal of pleasure to be asked on behalf of the football club to welcome Mick back to the club as a contemporary, and it's only my purpose here this evening not to try and match Pee Wee Young. He certainly has set the scene for this evening as far as Jayco is concerned, and so I'm not going to certainly try and outdo him. But for people, and there's a number of them I know in the room who really don't know Mick Nolan, because we're talking about 20 years ago, and that's a fair while down the track, and it sort of makes you shudder to think that it was that long ago that Mick was part of this football club. In fact, he's obviously still part of it and always will be. And it's my intention this evening simply to set the scene, particularly for some of the younger boys that are here and some of the new people into Wangaratta, to give you an idea of the sort of person that Mick Nolan was, and by way of introduction to him, and he can go on. I know that, as Pee Wee said, he's got a number of notes which he'll refer to in the course of the evening. Obviously, Pee Wee may have been a lion tamer. I think he's a lion bastard because I'm sure that things haven't changed a great deal. Mick hasn't got any notes at all. I have heard him speak on a couple of occasions, and I'll refer to those as, in a short time. If you really need to know anything about Mick Nolan, then you need to read the Chronicle tonight. Oh. And I'd like to recommend that to anybody that hasn't read tonight's Chronicle, and also congratulate Kevin on a great story, because that story tonight in the Chronicle was Mick Nolan as we knew him. Very quickly, Mick as a player, some of the memories as a fellow player with him in the time of the early 70s, when this club was equally as strong as it is now, and probably at the start of undoubtedly one of its strongest eras, probably the strongest era of any football club anywhere in Australia, the early 70s, and Mick was part of that, and we were very proud, a number of us in the room tonight, proud to be part of that time. As Kevin mentioned in his article tonight, Mick was a top trainer. He took half an hour at least to put his bandages on, and would run around probably to what's the forward flank on the far side of the ground when circuit training was in progress, and somehow, despite his frame, was able just to sneak in. And I don't think I've ever seen him in a warm-up lap. We used to have to, in those days, I think, do about 4, some years 6, and then 6 run-throughs to complement them. And Neville Hogan was fairly keen to make sure that no one blunched. If Wodonga were running 6 laps before the start of practice, then we used to have to run 8, and so on. And for some reason, and I know the reason, of course, is that he used to turn a blind eye to Mick and no one else, because Mick was such great value, and on the ground played 100 games. I think they were consecutive games, and was enormous value to the club, and so he seemed to get a bit of an easier run than some of us did. I can remember, lost this one. Yeah. Hello.
Thank you.
You ready? You still here?
Yes, sir.
Well, listen up, because you're going to mention. Before pre-season, at the start of each season, we'd have to run a circuit that used to go from this club room down to Phillipston Street, down Phillipston Street, back down Swan Street, which was around about, it's okay, is it? Which was 3 miles exactly, and if you didn't run that in a certain amount of time, you had to do it the next week. Now, I'm not sure that Mick actually ever run one of those. Did you ever do that? You did. And so you're part of a group that involved, I've got a couple of names written down here, Doherty, Norman, Sullivan, Rosser, and I used to tag along because they were my mates, that didn't do it in the time, and if you didn't do it in the time, of course, you had to do it next training night. And we decided that while we couldn't do it, there was a shortcut through the high school that would knock off a couple of minutes, and that would qualify us the second time round. And Brian Salmon must have, who wasn't present at the time, but heard that there was some skullduggery afoot, decided to park himself down near the Iceworks corner, which was the wrong end of the circuit because we'd already cut off 3 minutes running through the high school. Joel Dean looked amply puffed, got inside the time, and when we got back the second time, the blokes were doing 400s. They did them all night. We'd had a leisurely jog for about 20 minutes, kicked the footy backward and forth, and the fellas that were good enough to run it in the time were able to do their 400s and run for about 3 hours. It was the sort of thing that made the football season, or set the scene at the start of the year, and the 3 mile runs we managed to work down. We were unable to cut back into a couple of the earlier streets down Swan Street with Brian Salmon down there, but it wasn't a bad team when you look at it. And the names that I mentioned, a couple of league footballers and so on, were probably not the fittest of fellows when it comes to pre-season training. But when it comes to the fair dinkum thing, and you've only got to look on the boards, those names that I mentioned really were to the fore. Mick, I suppose, really made his mark in the 1972 grand final, and that was when Bill Stephen, who was working for North Melbourne, spotted Mick. He'd rucked tirelessly all that day, and I think from memory Eric Cornelius got the umpire's nod, and if he didn't, he'll say he did now because I've said it. And John Byrne, who was just a young player, about a 15 or 16-year-old, was also spotted by North Melbourne. But Mick was picked up. He'd already had a couple of trials at Geelong, and they didn't really want him. The Ovens and Murray selectors at no stage really wanted him. And so he headed off down to North Melbourne, and Bill Stevens obviously is a man of astute football judgment, because Mick went on to play 100 games, played a couple of grand finals, one premiership, and while the Ovens and Murray selectors didn't want him, there was one occasion I can remember clearly when the Victorian selectors apologised to Mick Nolan and also to Wale Roberts for not being selected in that particular Victorian side. So it's a fair way from the Tarrawingi Crusher to being selected in the Victorian football side, but with the stroke of the pen and the balance of the side, Mick and Wale dipped out. Obviously, in those days, the planes weren't big enough to have perhaps both of them on board. Or there may have been a beer strike in Adelaide or wherever the game was being played, so they made the judgment against Mick. But I also can recall, talking about VFL days, when Mick took on Graham Teasdale at Arden Street, and I was down at that game, and absolutely thrashed him man for man. And unfortunately, the full-back, who I think may have been David Dench at the time, elected to kick out to Mick playing on Teasdale, and Mick outmarked him. He just showed enormous body strength and skill, and at half-time, unfortunately, he couldn't come back on the ground because of a back strain or some such, and Graham Teasdale dominated that game, dominated the whole year, and won the Brownlow medal. But for those of us that were at Arden Street that day, I think that's probably the best I've seen Mick play, but obviously he's played equally as well in other games. In the 1975 grand final, North's first, we were down there again as a group of Wangaratta Rovers players, and some of us, and Mick played an extremely solid game, and really took the accolades of the NCG when Ron Barassi decided to take him off about 10 or 15 minutes before the end of the match. And you know, almost to a person, that side of the ground on the members' side of the MCG rose and applauded Mick as he came off and sat down on the bench. And we have seen, obviously, footing now with Barassi up in Sydney, where they've shown him winning that premiership or being the winning coach, and Mick also bursting up off the bench at the end of that match. But to someone that's just a friend of Mick, and I suppose if you know Tony, the girls would certainly know Tony in the netball, and what a wonderful adjunct that's been to our football club this year. If you know Chas, if you know Mick or Waldo or Joe, then you know Mick Nolan. You know, there's no pretence. That's the sort of person he is, and that's the sort of person he still is. But 100 games at Wangaratta Rovers, and then another 100 games at North Melbourne. At the end of that era, they were chasing ruckman. They always seemed to be chasing ruckman when Mick was down there, but they couldn't come up with anyone better. But eventually Mick was making his way from VFL football, and we really hoped that he would come back this way, not necessarily to Wangaratta Rovers, because you know, obviously there were coaching jobs available. Barry Cable, who was one of the greatest players to play the game, wanted to take Mick with him across to Western Australia because he deemed Mick to be the best ruckman he'd ever rode to, and there was also offerings in Queensland. Unfortunately for us, and I say that as a mate and as a group of friends from Wangaratta Rovers, Mick chose to go to Queensland, which eventually meant that we were going to see a lot less of him. But another 100 games. Now this is the bloke that was really, he was buggered as far as fitness and knees and everything else was concerned when he left the Rovers. He played 100 games at North, he played 100 games at Maine, he coached the premiership, and so 300 senior games of league football in a body that, you know, fellas from the outer at the MCG, well there's no outer in the MCG, but the outer at all the VFL grounds really used to identify with. When Mick ran out onto the ground, they used to feel good. And they'd say, well, if Mick can do it, you know, we might even be able to do it. But anyway, we'll have another tin and barrack for the D's or barrack for North. And he was the sort of bloke that really made an impression because he was identifiable as an ordinary sort of a bloke that had decided to take an extra step and actually make it. And that was the reason why I think he became not so much a lesbian, but a legend, but not a lesbian, Mick. I still think they look nice. A legend in AFL football. I think Lou Richards helped that a fair bit also. In the course of Mick's time at North Melbourne, a number of us also went down to the Mick Nolan roast. And that was an honour afforded to characters of the game and by various clubs, and North Melbourne took it up and they saw fit to see to honour Mick in that way, the Mick Nolan roast. It was a great night. It really didn't reflect, I didn't think, a great deal on the Mick Nolan that we knew, because there were a number of speakers there that basically were there to hang a bit on Mick and tell a number of jokes that basically weren't true. But by the same token, to have fellas like Lou Richards and so on running the show, a number of great league footballers getting up and speaking about a bloke who we just knew as an ordinary sort of a fellow was quite an enjoyable evening. And I think, no, that actual cartoon's a different one, but there was another weak cartoon that was struck for that particular evening. Since Mick has finished league football, in the course of it, up in Queensland, as I said, coaching a premiership, he became on one occasion, a Channel 7 commentator, the boundary line commentator. They had to actually move the boundary line in a little bit up at Queensland. And Mick was also writing a weekly column for the Brisbane newspaper. And in the Brisbane newspaper, Mick had said that he really reckons that the Brisbane Bears should be playing in Brisbane, you know, a man before his time. But unfortunately, Christopher Skase owned Carrara and Channel 7, and so Mick's life with Channel 7 was very short-lived. He was a bit dirty on that because he reckons he was getting more money doing the Channel 7 thing than he was writing the article for the newspaper. It was only last year, I think, we last ran into Mick, and we don't cross paths all that often, and I'm saying the people that know him, not only speaking personally. And it's interesting to see what happens to old Wangaratta Rovers players. But we were down at AFL Park last year, and the Teal Cup was on, the Australian array of young champions. All the recruiting people were there looking at who they were going to draft and so on. And we looked around that particular ground. I think Victorian Country was playing Queensland at the time, and Mick was down working for North Melbourne, and we picked half a Rovers side there that particular day. In fact, that day that we were there was the day that Rick, Mick's son, was making his debut with Maine in senior football in Queensland. It must have been a bit of a disappointment, I'm sure, that Mick wasn't able to be there. Also on that particular day, there was an article in the Sunday Press, and where are they now? What are they doing now? And Mick was featured in that. And best players he's ever seen. He's come up with fellas like Schimmel, Bush and Gregg and so on. You know, no Corneliuses, no Rosses, certainly no Welshes. We were a bit disappointed. We pointed that out to Mick when we saw him, actually, that he really could have gone into greater depth about some of the great players that he's seen play the game. On that particular day at AFL Park, we looked around. As I said, we picked half a Rovers side. Rowan Robertson was there working for North Melbourne. John Welsh was there working for Richmond. Neville Hagan was there working for Richmond. John Byrne was coach of the Victorian Countryside. Roger Giron was a selector and runner for the Victorian Countryside. Mick Nolan was down, as I mentioned, from Queensland. Damien Kelly was across from Perth working for Sydney Swans. Graham Booth was there also watching his cousin play for New South Wales. And I was there in my capacity with Melbourne Football Club. And it was almost like a mini reunion. And it's great to see players get together like that. It was great to be there on that day. But the thing that made the day that Mick was there, and the thing that makes tonight, as far as we're concerned, is Mick was here. And as I said, probably some of you may not understand why, because as I pointed out, he's not special in many ways and very special in other ways. And probably the way that he is particularly special is that he's very ordinary, very humble, and has just taken what success has come his way in the way that we know that a number of our present-day players take that success. I think that's one of the reasons why the Rovers is strong, is that they're humble, they apply themselves to the job, and they treat success as something that comes away after a lot of hard work and then look to the next challenge. Speaking of challenges, I can remember Mick also fancied himself as a cricketer. He played for United, and I think his greatest hour, the greatest hour that I can remember, was when there was a match against Magpies and we needed 13 runs to win. There was a fella that's also now a Brisbanean, his Laurie Flanagan was batting at the time, and Mick was in his rightful position at number 11, because of those days we didn't bat 12. Anyway, Mick went in needing 13 runs to win. It was a drop catch. There was a missed run out, actually there were a couple of close run outs. Well, actually there was a ball hit almost to the boundary line and they just scraped the single in. And the 13 runs were got, and then the last wicket partnership accumulated to 70 runs. And I think Laurie got 50, Mick got 20 odd, I'm not sure, but it was, I'm sure, his finest hour in cricket. And one that I can also very well remember. He was a fine basketballer, not so much for his movement around the ground, but his height. And in those days, the ignominious sort of event befell the Rovers Basketball Club. They kept putting the matches on about 10 o'clock at night on a Tuesday night or a Monday night. It really wasn't fair for blokes that, you know, had social functions to perform early in the week, and eventually the Rovers Football Club was banned for the Wangaratta Basketball Association. We had to hop in a car and drive down to Manila every week to play a game of basketball. Mick had a few mates, and there was a couple who remember, unfortunately, as I said, couldn't cope with the late night hours, and playing basketball and fouls were fairly common. As a guest speaker, I've heard Mick speak a couple of times. Once was at the Galen College, I think Champagnat College Catholic Church. I'm not sure what the function was in the in St Pat's Hall with Keith Stackpole, Peter Bakos, Alan Killigrew. But unfortunately on that particular day, Mick and I had met fairly early, and by the time we had got to I ended up going along as Mick's dad's chaperone, Pete, and it was a fairly earthy sort of a speech, I thought. As Alan Killigrew described it as, similar to Mick's football, he just kept plugging along and ploughing on, but I'm not too sure what the priest sitting in the front seat really thought of the whole address. But it gave an insight into the character and the sorts of things that go on in Melbourne. There was a story, and I'm not sure exactly the truth, but let's not confuse the truth with a good story at this stage of the evening, when Mick was asked to speak at the North Melbourne Social Club. And Mick had a quick look at me. I said, "You've got to speak at that social club thing tonight, Mick. This is after training." He said, "Oh yeah, who is it?" they said, oh, Ajax or something. He said, oh, well, Ajax, might be people work at Ajax or might be the Ajax Footy Club, you know. And, oh, that's okay, I'll handle it. I better ring Nettie up and tell I'll be a little bit late. And anyways, turned up into the social club and got the jumper on there, tie. He actually was dressed reasonably well for the evening, but it turned out to be the Apex presidents of Victoria, the Apex presidents of Australia, I'm not sure, who were all there in dinner suits. And so Mick's address and so on had to be radically changed very quickly from the Ajax Footy Club, where were a few blokes from around Footscray, to the Apex presidents of Australia. Apparently there was one bloke that decided he was going to see how smart Mick was and got up and answered a question, and similar gathering to this. And the words were fairly long, the meaning was a little bit profound, and there was an unease that went across the room because they could, the rest of the presidents of these Apex clubs could see exactly what this fellow was trying to do to Mick. But in no uncertain terms, Mick gave an answer which you would normally give if you're working out in the crusher and someone asks you a stupid question. It was very brief and very concise and very much to the point. And this fellow sat down with a red face to the applause of all others gathered in the room, who stood to their feet and clapped him for his very short but very succinct answer. Let's hope that this evening Mick has no need to make such reference to anyone in the room. I must also say that I was actually at Mick's place the day that Ron Joseph signed him for North Melbourne. He'd been out to North Wang and had a talk to Billy Byrne regarding John, and Bill Byrne said just come back in a year or so, I'll tell you when the boy's ready. And so I got dropped around to Mick's place, and it was Ron Joseph and Keith Craig and some little kid, I don't know who it was, probably might have been Wayne Carey or someone, I don't know, but he's only about a 5-year-old. Very hot day, and I know that there was, in the course of discussion, an inducement for Mick to start training immediately. This was around about December, if I can remember correctly, may have even been early January. If he would start training immediately with North Melbourne and forego the Wangaratta Rovers South Sea Island cruise. Mick was in a predicament. It must have taken him, I would imagine, 1, possibly 2 seconds to make up his mind as to what he should do. And he said, no, I think I'll go on the trip with me mates. And so come back probably slightly worse for the wear, but started training and also started a magnificent career with North Melbourne. That's just an insight into some of the things that obviously I'm not going to tip the bucket on Mick or tell a number of stories that we probably could. But may I say, on behalf of everyone gathered here, Mick, that it's wonderful to see you back at the Wangaratta Rovers, the home of the football club, the club that I know you still call your own, as we do, and now ask you to come forward and perhaps elaborate on some of the things I've said, but also produce one of your finest speeches ever.
What a bullshit.